shirt that you already like and that already fits you. Since you're going to be cloning this shirt, you might as well clone a shirt that you like. Try to find a shirt that has clear and simple pattern pieces. On this shirt, you can see that there's one piece for the main front, there's one piece for the back, and there's one piece for each sleeve. The next step is to take your sheet of plastic and put it over your cotton t-shirt. This is a cotton jersey knit that is also dyed. I've used some plastic that I found at a dollar store to complete this step. Once the plastic is over your shirt, go ahead and mark where the center of the shirt is, and using your Vis-a-Vis wet erase marker, go ahead and trace all around each pattern piece right on the edge using your marker. It's really important to use a dark color marker for this step. I highly recommend using the Vis-a-Vis markers because they wipe away very easily, but make sure that you're outlining on the outside very clearly before you move on to the next step. Go ahead and take your clean paintbrush, a squirt bottle full of water, and grab a piece of cotton muslin. Cotton muslin or cotton poplin is important for this step because you need for the fabric to absorb the water. Your next step is to go ahead and spray the cotton muslin with your water. You want it to be fairly damp but not wet, and then take your clean paintbrush and with a painting motion go right over the lines that you've drawn on your plastic paper. If you don't see that the wet erase Vis-a-Vis marker has transferred to the cotton muslin, go ahead and use a little bit more water on the material to really pick up the wet erase ink and transfer it from the plastic to your piece of cotton muslin. So I'm going to go over this one more time. Oh, see, now you can kind of see the blue ink of the marker piercing through the cotton. Flip it up, and when you're satisfied that you have a good impression of your shirt pattern, go ahead and flip it over. I'm going to zoom in so you can really see the lines that have been created by spraying down with water and using the paintbrush to go over the lines. Now, I hope you can see this, but I've made two small lines where the shoulders are. Those are to remind me where the shoulder placement is. And go ahead and use, I'm using just a plain ballpoint pen for this step, to just go over the lines that I've made. So I'm going to use my straight edge to make the center line much more clear. And here I'm using a French curve to true or neaten up the lines that I've made where the shoulder seam is. As you can see, I'm going to go ahead and draw in the hash marks or notch marks to mark where the different pattern pieces are going to come together. And again, you can see I'm using the French curve to really define the shape of the sleeves. And then here, since the shoulder pattern piece is actually only the front of the shoulder piece, I'm still going to outline it because it's still important to have that shape. And I'm also going to use a French curve to true or neaten up the line at the neckline. And again, on the sides, I'm just going to go ahead and go over really well with my ballpoint pen. It looks like the line transferred really neatly, so just making it a little bolder makes it easier to see. And as always, I'm going to take a moment to label the pattern pieces. So I've labeled the front, and I've also labeled the front sleeve. The next step is to do the back of your jersey knit shirt. So again, take the same shirt, lay it out nice and flat, and we're going to repeat the same process that we did with the front of the shirt. So again, we're going to take our sheet of plastic. Again, this sheet of plastic was only $2 at the local dollar store. I got 2 yards of this plastic table covering. It works a charm for this. Since I've already used my Vis-a-Vis marker, I'm just going to take a moment to wipe that off. And again, same process as the front. We're going to mark out where the center of the back of the shirt is. And then we're just going to draw a straight line right down the middle. And that is going to represent a half-point part of our shirt back. And again, I'm going to go ahead and outline the sleeves. So I'm going to trace right on top of the stitching that I see on the shirt. I'm going to trace right on top of that as I outline. And as you can see, I've made 2 marks on the sleeve back where that seam meets the body of the shirt. That is so that I have a visual reminder that that portion of the sleeve pattern is supposed to face the back. And again, just go right around the edges and mark out the edges of that sleeve. Again, this is why I prefer to use the plastic. It makes it really super easy to see. And this is a great way for beginners to learn like what the basic pattern shapes are. And it also gives you a chance to really see how pattern pieces come together. And as usual, I'm going to go ahead and indicate what pattern piece is what. So I've put center back and then I've put sleeve back. And we're going to go ahead and repeat the same process that we did with the front of the shirt. One thing that I am doing here is I'm using my straight edge to make the center back mark more bold. This is just making it easier for me when I do the water trace on this pattern. And then here, I'm actually going to take an extra moment to use my French curve right on top of the seam. So that way I get a better line when I do the water pattern trace. You can always do this after, it's totally up to you, but I just want to show you what that looks like. You know, some people find it easier. I myself find it a little bit easier. But again, this is the first step of our water trace pattern. So it's up to you when you want to do this. So again, just as the front, we've taken our sheet of cotton muslin and our spray bottle of water, and again sprayed all over the surface of our cotton muslin fabric to get a nice clean trace. Again, you want the muslin or your cotton poplin fabric to be damp but not soaking wet. And again, I'm going to use my clean paintbrush to paint on, or in some cases I'm going to dab when I need a little bit more of a guarantee that I'm picking up the ink on the other side of the cotton. Most importantly, as you can see, I'm using my hand to hold the muslin firm on top of the plastic. You really don't want the muslin to move a whole lot. And again, if you flip it over and notice that you're not getting much of an ink transfer, go ahead and respray it and repaint it. In this case, it's faint, but everything looks exactly the way I want it to look. So I can move on to my next step, which is, again, switching to a ballpoint pen to just go over the lines that I've created for this side of the shirt. So again, I'm marking the center seam first. And now here I am drawing in the neckline. And then I'm going to trace over the seam line for the back seam that runs from the shoulder piece to the center back piece. And I actually prefer to use a ballpoint pen for this step. You know, especially when you're working with cotton muslin, it tends to be kind of a draft fabric anyway, so now is a really great time to make those lines. You know, if you want to leave extra notes to yourself, you can. I highly recommend using chalk or a ballpoint pen on this step. If you use your water-based vis-a-vis marker and your fabric is still damp, you may not quite get the clean lines that you want to achieve during this step. And again, just as before, I'm making notes to mark what is the center back and what is the sleeve. And now we have our basic pattern pieces for the back of our shirt. So here's what our pattern pieces look like side by side. So we have the back and we have the front. So our next step is to take our scissors and just cut out our pattern pieces. You want to cut right on top of the line. That's crucially important, is when you cut on top of the lines that you've drawn. Try not to cut on the inside of the line, otherwise you're going to end up maybe with a smaller shirt than you had anticipated. And don't cut on the outside of the line, because you may end up with a slightly larger shirt than you anticipated. For this pattern, cut right on top of the line that was drawn. Now here, when we get to the sleeves, you're going to do the same thing. You're going to cut right on top of the line that you've drawn, not to the left and not to the right. You really want to cut right on top, because you'll get a very true pattern by doing so. And I'm going to cut out the sleeve here. And let's see, I just need to cut off that little part up top. Okay, there we go. And now we've got the center back pattern piece and we've got the back sleeve pattern piece. And I'm now going to cut out the front. And in part, this is why we label our pattern pieces as we go. Sometimes, especially with t-shirts, the shape of the front pattern piece looks a lot like the shape of the back pattern piece. You know, if you weren't going to label them and you're new to sewing, it might be difficult to differentiate between what piece goes where. So always make sure that as you create patterns, you know, whether you're a beginner or whether you're more advanced, always be sure that you label your pattern pieces. It makes it a lot easier for you to assemble everything later. There we go, and we're going to cut out the sleeve front. And we're almost done with the main pieces of our jersey knit t-shirt pattern. Cool, so now we have a sleeve front, and we have a t-shirt front, and a back, and then there you go. So you can see that we have 4 pattern pieces to work with. Now, if we looked at our jersey knit t-shirt, one thing that you'll notice, oh, by the way, I'm just going to go ahead and clean this while I talk. It's super easy to clean your plastic. It's a wet erase marker that we used. If you use the vis-a-vis marker, just some water, grab a terry cloth and just wipe it down. You'll know if it wasn't a wet erase marker. If the marker that you use does not come off the plastic, please be sure to use a wet erase marker. So here, let's take a look at the 2 pattern pieces that we created for the sleeves. If we look at our shirt, we notice that that sleeve is all one piece. So in this step, we're going to combine the sleeve front with the sleeve back. Super easy, stick them side by side, outline right around them. Just make sure you put them next to each other, take your dry erase marker and then go all the way around and make sure that you transfer your hash marks, marking what side goes to the front and what side goes to the back. You can see those two checks there. I'm using a French curve to true up my pattern, so I want to make sure it's a nice smooth transition from the front to the back of the sleeve. And now that it's all outlined on the plastic, I'm going to go ahead and make some notes as to what goes to the back and what goes to the front, and then I will put down my muslin and make the water trace to combine these two pattern pieces. So again, I'm just going to take a slightly smaller piece of cotton muslin to suit the size of my pattern piece. And then just as before, take your spray bottle, spray it down, make sure it's nice and damp but not wet. And then we're going to take our clean unused paintbrush and we are going to go right over those lines. I think this piece of material is a little bit more moist, but you can see that the ink is transferring very clearly to the other side. Okay, so that looks pretty clean. We're going to flip it over. And before we reuse our plastic, just once more, take, a piece of terry cloth or a rag or something and just wipe down and get rid of any extra ink that's left over on our piece of plastic. So just as we did with the front and the back, we're going to take our ballpoint pen and we're going to go ahead and retrace the outline of the pattern. We've already trued this pattern in the process, so it's a safe bet to just kind of go over the edges. And again, on this step, use a ballpoint pen. Don't use the Vis-a-Vis wet erase marker for this step. If there's any water remaining on the muslin, it's going to bleed, making your lines fuzzy. Ballpoint pen, by contrast, isn't going to run. So here I'm going to use my rotary cutter and just cut right on top of the outline of the pattern. Again, right on top of the line, not to the left and not to the right of the line. The goal here is to get a true shape of this pattern, and when you cut to the right or the left of the line, you may end up with something a little bit too large or a little bit too small, or it's just a pattern piece that doesn't match with the other pattern pieces, which may distort the outcome of your project. Cool. So that looks like a pretty clean line. All right, so now let's review. We now have three main pattern pieces. We have a sleeve pattern piece for the left and right sleeves. We have the front pattern piece, and we have the back pattern piece for our shirt. Also, mark the sleeve pattern. You can also reuse these pattern pieces. This is the best thing about making your own patterns, is you can reuse them over time. So now we can match these up. Remember how we made those two hash marks on the sleeve and the front pattern? We can match them up and see where those go. And now I'm going to flip this over so you can see how the back matches up. So if we were to match up the back, those hash marks that we made, let's go ahead and line them up, and you can see that our sleeve pattern matches up to where it connects with the back side of the pattern. And that's exactly what we want, and that's exactly why you make these marks between your pattern pieces. If you buy a pattern piece from, say, like McCall's or Berta or one of those places, you'll notice on the outside edges that there's these little black triangles made. Those are notch marks, and those perform the same functions as our little marks. Those are placement marks, so that when you cut out your patterns, you can match them up in the right place. I'm going to go ahead and put in an arrow. This is called the grain line. This is going to help us orient the pattern when we cut it out of our jersey knit material. On our sleeve, we want the grain line to go along the center line. So I'm going to go ahead and make a little mark there. And then we're going to do the same with the front. It's important to note the grain line, especially when you're working with knit fabrics, because with knit fabrics, you may have more stretch horizontally, where you won't have as much stretch vertically. And depending on where you want the stretch to go, you want to know where the grain line is, because that's kind of where the stretchiness or lack thereof kind of orients itself. This applies to both wovens and to knits, but in our beginner lesson on making your own knit pattern and sewing with knits, it's your grain line on the shirt is usually going to run vertically from top to bottom. I'm going to use my iron to dry out our pattern pieces. I'm going to use a little bit of steam to make sure that everything is super, super nice and flat, but I'm still going to iron the pattern piece until it's like bone dry to the touch. Ironing your pattern piece is going to help you in our next step when we start using what we've created to make a pattern on our material. So really try to keep it flat. When you work with a nice flat ironed pattern, you get the true size of the pattern. You don't get, the weirdness that comes with wrinkles and bumps later on. So just make sure that you iron your pattern. This also goes for paper patterns, by the way. If you buy a paper pattern from the store, I always encourage people to iron out the pattern. Use a dry iron for paper because you don't want to introduce moisture into the paper, but do be sure that you iron out your pattern. If things are wrinkled and you start to pin them up, the shape might be distorted, so that when you sew up your final garment, you might be like, oh my gosh, but I thought it was an inch smaller, an inch larger. And going back, you'll realize you may have lost the true shape of the pattern because it wasn't ironed. So I'm going to go ahead and iron all three of my pattern pieces. And again, just make sure that it's bone dried at the touch, because when you make a water transfer pattern, if it's still wet, if the pattern piece is still wet, and you put it on top of the cloth that you want to use to make your final garment, that ink might transfer away from the muslin and onto your final material, and that's not so good. So just make sure it's nice and dry. If the pattern piece is dry, your wet erase marker is not going to transfer. So here I'm going to go ahead and begin cutting out my shirt. So we're going to actually do two things in this step. You can see that I'm folding over my piece of cotton jersey knit material. I'm folding it along the grain line, so you'll see almost like grooves in the jersey knit if you look close. I'm folding it so that those grooves are parallel to the fold line. And here I'm going to go ahead and pin down the back side to my shirt pattern. Now, pinning is important. I'm a huge fan of pinning your pattern pieces down. If you choose to do so, you can use pattern weights as well. I just find it easier to use a couple of straight pins. If you notice, I'm only really pinning in the corners of the pattern. I'm not putting a whole lot of pins on long straight lines, partly because it's not necessary, and partly I just find it faster and easier to use as few pins as is effective to complete the task. So now that we've got our pattern piece, what we need to do is we need to add a seam allowance. So to accomplish this, I'm using a hand compass. This is something I picked up for about $15 at an art store. And I'm going to take my compass and I'm going to measure out a space of 5/8 of an inch between the metal compass point and the pencil point. Now that we've got that set, we're going to use the compass to create our seam allowance. So you just line up the metal edge and then use the pencil edge on the opposite of it to mark out a 5/8 inch wide border along the perimeter of our pattern piece. And a seam allowance is important. The seam allowance is going to give you the required space such that when you stitch the pattern pieces together, the pattern and the two pattern pieces as they come together will come together at the right point, and you'll have seam allowance to work with. So just in case you need to make it bigger or smaller later on in the process, you can do that if you leave adequate seam allowance. Without a seam allowance, if you were to cut this out and cut it right on the line and stitch up your shirt, you would find that your shirt would be a little bit smaller than you anticipated, and that's because you didn't plan to have this extra material available to you to complete your sewing. And now that I have my seam allowance marked out in pencil on my material, I am just going to go ahead and cut right on top of that line that I just drew in pencil, all the way around my pattern piece, and that is going to become the back of my pattern. And if you've gotten this far, good job. As this is a beginner lesson, I'm always really proud of people who take on these challenges and really start to see them through to the end. Sometimes people get frustrated when they learn to sew because they don't feel like they've made anything or they don't fully understand the process. So if you've gotten this far, I'm really excited for you, and I hope that you'll stick with us and clone your shirt. You don't have to use a rotary cutter, by the way. You can just use a pair of plain fabric scissors. And yay, I've cut out my pattern piece. So we'll go ahead and set that aside. And I will go ahead and lay out the front pattern piece. So here I've used the remaining portion of my fabric, folded it over lengthwise, and I've already pinned up my front pattern piece, and just like we did before, I'm going to use my handheld compass to mark out a 5/8 inch wide space, and I'm going to use my compass to create my seam allowance. I very much prefer using a compass over using one of those hem measuring things. I just find the compass way easier to use because the distance stays fixed as you trace around. It does just a much faster and easier job than using the little metal hem measuring tools. Ultimately it's up to you, whatever you find easiest. I like the compass because you can measure and mark at the same time. So again, I'm going to trace my marks and onto my fashion material, onto the white cotton jersey before I cut. And again, when I begin to cut, I'm going to make sure that I cut right on top of the penciled in seam allowance line. You want to cut right on top because if you cut toward the inner, you might end up with a slightly smaller shirt than you anticipated. If you cut too far on the outside, you're going to end up with a slightly larger shirt than you anticipated. So again, cut right on top of the line. Okay, so I'm pretty satisfied with this. And now I'm going to move on to the sleeve. So I've actually got two sides of the sleeve. So I'm going to align the grain line with my material, and I'm going to kind of put it in such a way that I have a little bit of a border right around the edges. And again, I'm just going to use a couple of pins. Don't need to use a whole lot of pins to do this. Just enough pins at the corners of the material to make sure that the pattern piece is on the fabric and that it is really flat, so when I begin to measure and cut, I get a very true shape. So again, I'm going to use my compass to make that 5/8 inch border. Again, I'm going to measure, just make sure that my compass is actually at the width that I need. And there we go. So once again, we're going to align the metal point of the compass with the edge of the pattern piece, and then I'm going to use the pencil end of the compass to make a dotted line that goes all the way around the perimeter of my pattern. And again, please make sure that your seam allowances are consistent. With this pattern piece, I'm using a 5/8 inch seam allowance. This tends to be the standard in many American dress patterns. If you are European and watching this, it's very common to see 1 centimeter or 1.5 centimeter as your seam allowance. In all honesty, choose whatever seam allowance you would like, although it's extremely beneficial if you use these standard measurements. So the standard seam allowance in the States is 5/8 of an inch. The standard in Europe tends to be about 1 centimeter or 1.5 centimeters. Use the standard for your area. It makes everything a lot easier in the long run, trust me. So now that I've got my pattern pieces, I've cut out my front pattern pieces, I have my sleeve pattern piece, and I am just going to go ahead and start to match them up to one another. So if you notice, remember how we created those marks? We cut them, little notch, and now what we're going to do is we're going to match up these notches to one another before we begin to pin our pattern pieces together in preparation for sewing. So here you can see I'm matching up the single notch on my shirt front pattern with the notch that I've made on the sleeve pattern. And if you recall, we had 1 notch for the front and 2 notches for the back. And by matching the 1 notch on the sleeve with the 1 notch on the front, it is really easy for us to match up our pattern pieces correctly. So what we're going to do is just take a couple straight pins and just pin it. I'm using about an inch, inch and a half between the pins. Just use enough pins that are comfortable for you. I recommend a pin for every like inch and a half or so. That tends to be the magic number for me. And I also like to pin perpendicular to the edge of the material. If you pin where the pins kind of follow the line, you end up having a lot of spiky things very close together, and it makes it a little bit more annoying when we get to the sewing step. So here I'm going to take my sleeve pattern and I'm going to match it up with the back pattern. Again, first let's find the notch that we created, and we're going to match those up and pin those first. Okay, cool. And then we'll just go ahead and pin together the remaining parts of the pattern. Now, sometimes your pattern pieces will curve and it's going to seem as if the pieces don't quite match up. But again, this is part of the pinning process. This is your chance to kind of dry fit everything together and kind of see where they are. So if you notice it's a little bit off, this is your opportunity to go back and revise and pin it until you're satisfied with the result. And now we're going to go ahead and pin the other side. So again, match up like with like. So find where you made your notches and match up the notches first between the pattern pieces, and then go ahead and pin the remaining parts of the pattern. Again, you can see that I'm pinning perpendicular to the edge of the pattern pieces. Perpendicular meaning that my pins form a 90-degree angle between the edge of the material and the pin. And there we go. So we've matched up our sleeve to the edge, and we've got everything pinned up here. It looks good. It looks nice and clean. And if we lay this out, you can see that we're getting a lot closer to a completed shirt. If you've gotten this far in the process, congratulations. You are complete making your shirt pieces. We've cut those out, we've pinned them together, we have a clear idea where we're going, and now we come to sew. So if you remember from a previous lesson, I explained how to make a stitch portfolio. A stitch portfolio is super useful, especially for things like this, because we can see what kind of stitch does what on our machine, and we can set up our sewing machine to do the stitch that we need for our jersey knit. Now for the jersey knit, you're going to want, especially because this is a tutorial made for people who are new to sewing knits, you're going to want to use a very small but very wide zigzag stitch. So you're going to set your stitch length to something low. You're going to put your machine on a zigzag stitch, and then you're going to put your fabric under the presser foot, and you want to make sure that you're honoring that 5/8 inch seam allowance. On my sewing machine, there's actually a little mark that shows where 5/8 of an inch is. So go ahead and align your fabric with the 5/8 inch mark on your sewing machine. And then I'm going to go ahead and sew using a zigzag stitch. Again, this is a beginner tutorial. So as a beginner, more likely than not, you don't have that many different stitches available to you on your sewing machine. So the easiest is to do a simple zigzag stitch. Now, when sewing knits, as you can see, I'm using something called a walking foot. That foot is really great because it gives you better feeding of your knit material underneath the presser foot. So, highly recommended when you sew knits. If you don't have a walking foot, then you can use a Teflon foot or a roller foot to complete this part of the process. Cool, so I've sewn my first stitch, and let's see if we can see that there. Great. And the reason that we use a zigzag stitch is it allows jersey knit to stretch. So go ahead and sew up all 4 of the seams. Don't sew up the side seams yet. And now we're going to do the collar line. So since this is a beginner's tutorial, what we're going to do is we're going to try to honor the original style of the shirt, and that uses a really simple facing for the neck. So first what you're going to do is you're going to measure all the way around the neck of our pattern. So just take your measuring tape, start from one side and just measure all the way around. Here I found that it's about 20.5 inches. And I also, quick note guys, be sure that you clip off any of these extra little threads. Just cut them off right after you sew them and before you do other things. Sometimes these extra threads will just cause problems further on down the line. It's also just a cleaner workspace. So I've measured my neckline. I'm also going to measure right along the sleeves of my shirt, because I'm also going to make a small sleeve facing to finish the shirt edge. It's going to be the same size as the neck facing, so it's just best to measure them both at the same time. And to make a very simple facing out of jersey knit, just take a piece of jersey knit, fold it along the grain line, and go ahead and measure. We want to see about a 1/2 inch wide facing. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut the facing. The width of our narrow strip is going to be about 1 1/8 inches wide. So I've gone ahead and I've taken my hand compass and made the measurement of about 1 1/8 inches. And now I'm going to use my straight edge and my compass together to measure and just make sure that as I mark the straight edge that it's really hitting the width that I need. Again, really recommend using a compass here. It makes it super easy to both measure and mark at the same time. Sometimes if you just use a ruler or your tape measure to do these width measurements, sometimes you're a little bit off. Using a compass makes it a lot easier. Using a straight edge and using your rotary cutter makes it super easy to cut these long strips of binding for the neck and for the sleeves. And what I'm using as a straight edge is something called like a T-measure. It is a super useful tool to have in your sewing kit. As a beginner, if you don't have one, you don't absolutely need one as a beginner. But if you are so fortunate to have been gifted a sewing machine, hopefully with a gift card, I would recommend getting one of those as your measuring tool, because it does so many things and it'll serve you in a million different ways in the future. Now, I'm gonna have to cut some more binding. I have enough for the neck and I need to get a little bit more for the sleeves. So one easy way is to just tape just go ahead and just cut, I think the total that I need for this project is 43 inches. So I've cut 43 inches of this binding. It's just regular binding, and it's not bias binding. So here you can see I'm pinning on our 1 1/8 inch wide strip of binding, which is still folded in half, by the way. I'm pinning it along the edge of my sleeve. And I'm pinning them right sides together, so that what I'm seeing is going to be the underside, or the part of the shirt that touches my skin when I put it on. And let's see, I'm just going to go ahead and take my other piece of sleeve binding and pin that right along the edge. So again, pin perpendicular to the edge of your pattern piece. It will make things a lot easier. When you pin the other way, and that is to say when you pin with the pin facing the same direction as the edge of your pattern piece, sometimes you get distortion. It's just annoying. It's just annoying. It is super annoying to me to do that. So pin perpendicular. I hope you guys like the background music. I find it very soothing. I think it's awesome. But if you have any background music requests, or if you have a band and you would like to make it the background music, please feel free to leave a comment. And I am happy to make your music my background music. Copyright provisions providing. So what we're going to do with the neck piece, it's going to sound complicated, but it's not, is you're going to take your 1 1/8 inch wide strip, you're going to stitch it closed along the edge, and then you're going to fold it back over, but you want to fold it so that the wrong side is facing the inside. so that the right side of the collar facing is the one that's facing out. So just watch me, watch how I'm handling this. When it comes to jersey knit, you really don't want to stretch the material while you pin it. So what I found helps the most is for me to put a couple pins on either side to start, and then put another couple pins in between those. That way, when everything is fully pinned, it's pinned very evenly all around the perimeter of our binding, or in this case, we can also call it something of a neck facing. Cool, so it looks like we have a super sharp masochist sweatband right now. But never fret, we're gonna go ahead and take this band and we're gonna pin it to our shirt. So what we have is we have our shirt that's still turned inside out so you can see where the seams are, and then we're gonna take our neck facing, and the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna find the back, so that's where the seam is, and we're gonna go ahead and pin that folded side in toward the body of the shirt. The open edge you want to put on the edge of the pattern piece, and we're going to go ahead and pin right along the edges of our neck. So go slow, take your time with this if you need. When you get to a seam, what you want to do is you want to fold that seam so that it faces more toward the back of your shirt rather than the front. It'll give you a much cleaner finish when you complete the project. So again here, go slowly, go a couple inches at a time. As a beginner, you're new to this, you don't need to learn everything in one day. Take your time. If you want to stop here and pick it up later, feel free. The greatest enemy toward completing your sewing projects is rushing through them. When you rush, that's when problems come up, not because you're necessarily unskilled, but because you're not taking the time to consider what you're doing if you kind of rush through things. So again, when you get to a seam, just go ahead and fold that seam so that it kind of faces more toward the back of your garment rather than the front. And then just sew it the same way you did with the other parts. So now, by this time, you should have sewn your sleeves and their facings on, as well as a neckline. And now, the next step to completing our shirt is we're gonna go ahead and cut off the excess seam allowance. You still want to leave a little bit of material on the other side of that seam allowance, but just outside of the edge of the zigzag stitch, go ahead and cut off whatever extra seam allowance is there. Some people prefer not to cut it off. That's your prerogative. I generally tend to cut it off because it gives a little bit of a cleaner finish to the completed shirt, especially on the neckline. If you don't need the extra bulk here, you don't need the extra bulk. So just cut off the extra seam allowance. Some people may say, wait, but that's what a serger is for. This is a tutorial intended for beginners, and usually when you learn to sew, you get a regular single needle home sewing machine at first before you start getting an overlocker or a serger machine. So if you have problems with this, feel free to discuss it in the comments of the video. But in the context of this video, which is angled more towards beginners, zigzag stitch is fine. You don't need a serger to sew knits. You're cool. So now that we've cut off the extra seam allowance, what we're going to do is we are going to use lots and lots and lots of steam and our iron to press the seams of our shirt before we move on to the next step. Pressing is important because it's going to give you a much cleaner finish when everything is said and done. You can see what it looks like after I've used tons of steam to press it. If you notice, I'm using a piece of muslin between my iron and the jersey knit material. I'm doing this for two reasons. It will prevent anything that's on the bottom of the iron from getting onto your fashion material, in this case the jersey knit, and also because it does a really good job of soaking up any extra water. Sometimes with your iron, when you use a lot of steam, extra water might dribble out, and using a press cloth will protect your material from that. So we've done the sleeves, and now we're going to iron the neckline. So again, use lots of steam and press. If you can see, I'm actually picking up and putting down my iron in very small hops during this process. I find that you'll get much better results if you steam and press. And what I'm doing here, this kind of hopping up and down motion, that is pressing your material. Quick press, quick steam, pick up the iron, hop a couple times. When you slide your iron across the material, one nasty side effect is it might warp or distort the cloth. And when you're working with knits, you really don't want to handle the fabric too much. You don't want to stretch the material while you're in the process of sewing it. So again, kind of lay everything out on the right side, use your press cloth, and steam and press. And sometimes the most difficult parts to steam and press properly are when you get to like the outside edges of corners. That's fine. Just, use smaller areas to work with when you steam and press, and you'll be fine. So now let's see where we're at. Awesome. So we've got two sleeves. We've got the front and the back of the shirt assembled. Looking good. And one thing that I am going to add to this shirt that I'm not sure was on the original shirt is I'm going to add a piece of bias cut jersey to stabilize the back of the shirt. This will prevent the neck of the shirt from warping as you put it on and off several times. So to create your own bias strip, what you're going to do is you're going to make a 45-degree angle with your fabric. To be sure it's the right angle, you can see I've used a compass, but in general, you just fold it over on the grain on the diagonal. That's the bias grain. Knit fabric does have a bias grain. Now, the reason why we're doing the bias grain for this small part of the shirt is you do want there to be the ability to stretch with this small piece of material, but you don't want there to be, you don't want it to stretch in the same way that the shirt stretches, because this is being added for stability and to keep the shape of the neckline. So you kind of want a piece of fabric that's going to be able to stretch and bounce back fairly quickly. So here, this is where the bias cut of jersey knit comes in. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a little piece of bias tape with this, and it's really easy to do. So now that we've cut our material, I'm going to put it on my ironing board, and I'm going to fold in the two edges of the material. So here you can see I'm using a couple of pins to aid me in this effort. Just a couple pins on the ironing board itself, just to keep it stable. And I just want to make it so that when I fold over the edges, that they touch right in the middle. The piece of fabric that I'm using is about 1.25 inches wide. And now here I'm using my iron to steam and press. So now that I've got one side of my jersey net pinned in, I'm going to go ahead and fold the other side. And again, because it's such a small and narrow piece of fabric, it's helpful to pin directly into the ironing board itself. So again, just a couple of pins in some key areas. I'm not stretching out the jersey knit material at all. I'm just trying to keep it nice and flat. And then again, using lots of steam, I'm going to go ahead and steam and press. And then when you're done, just go ahead and flip that over. And just to make sure that all the creases that we've made with the iron are nice and locked in place, we're going to give it one last final steam. So what we're going to do with that piece that we've just made is we're going to look at the back seam, and then this piece is going to go right along that back seam. So first let's cut it to size. So I've gone about 1 inch, maybe about 1.5 inches possibly past the seam line. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold over the edges on the far left and right. I'm going to cut at a bit of an angle. That angle is really important because it makes it less bulky when we fold over the two ends to create our neck, kind of like neck. Oh, I've got to Google this. If you want to Google it for me and add what you found in the comments, feel free. So this piece of bias cut jersey material is going to be acting as our neck facing, and neck facing on almost all patterns that have neck facing is here to add stability to the finished garment. It's on the inside of the garment. In this case, it's on the inside of our neckline, of course, neck facing. And it's not something that someone's going to see when you put on the shirt right away, but it is something that will make your shirt last much longer because it'll prevent, the warping of the neckline of your shirt after repeated wear. And by the way, if you have t-shirts that you like a lot but don't have this neck facing on there, if it's something that you really like, this is an easy adjustment that you can make to shirts that you already own that don't have a neck facing on there. Cool, so we're nice and pinned up. And once it's all pinned, we're going to put it under our sewing machine, and this is the use case for a straight stitch on knit material. You can also use a zigzag stitch. You'll get a little bit more stretch, but in my case, my goal is to sew this facing onto the neckline to prevent too much stretching as I put on and off the shirt. So in this case, on this particular part of the garment, I am using a straight stitch to complete this step. So I've also adjusted the thread tension on my sewing machine. I've given it a little bit more slack for me as I make the straight stitch on the neck facing. I find that it's a little bit of a better finish, and also when you give it a little bit more tension, your straight stitch won't snap when you wear this garment, and that's really important. But everywhere else on this shirt, we're using a zigzag stitch, so over time it really shouldn't be that big of a deal. When I put on the shirt, I want the shirt to only really stretch on the front piece and up by the shoulders. I really don't want the back neck of the shirt to stretch, again, because over time it's going to lead toward kind of a saggy looking neckline, and that's kind of not where it's at. So as you sew, go ahead and just pull the pins away before the pins go under the needle. You don't want to break your needles, but you do want to kind of keep your fabric together. So when you're sewing knits, I recommend using a walking foot. If you don't have a walking foot, if you have a Teflon presser foot, use that. If you don't have a Teflon presser foot, you can also find a roller foot as well. So any one of these are going to be totally fine for you to use. They're all going to be good for working with simple jersey knits like the one that I'm using here in this example. Cool, so now I've got my neck facing sewn on. I'm going to trim off these extra pieces of thread. And now I'm going to go ahead and pin the sides together. So go ahead and flip your shirt so that it's inside out. And now you're going to match up the sides of your shirt. So you're going to match up the sides all the way from the sides of the sleeves, match the seams, match the shoulder seams together on both sides. And then once those are matched up and pinned, then go ahead and move toward pinning the rest of the side seams on your shirt. If you've gotten this far, congratulations. I'm excited for you. Learning how to make your own clothes is super awesome for a variety of reasons. And in your daily life, it just gives you so much leeway. So here is what our sewn together and completed shirt looks like.